And that's the thing about Russia. You might not be necessarily arrested because of something you say or do, but the thing is you could be. Russia now, there's a lot of people who, they had Twitter, they had Instagram, they had an outward-facing world, but now you've got a situation where patriotic lessons in school, new sort of emerging youth movements. If a child is growing up in this propaganda atmosphere now, well, also you've had a real brain drain of sort of diverse ideas as well, with people who had different points of view leaving the country. I think it's worrying where it might be in a few years' time. I think at the moment it's still sort of struggling to get a hold of people who remember the world before.
Andy Hayward, hello. How's it going?
Hi, very good, thank you.
Good.
Good to be here.
Very glad to have you here. We're going to be talking about your film, Warped by War Inside Putin's Russia. Before we get into it, tell viewers who you are.
So my name's Andy Hayward. I'm a filmmaker, producer, journalist. Until very recently, I was working at Vice, and now I'm freelance.
So this documentary is filmed inside Russia. It's about Russia, a year inside Russia. So can you just sort of begin by describing what life is like in Putin's Russia? Give us a sense of kind of the everyday inside the country.
Well, I think for a lot of people, there is a lot of apathy and kind of burying their heads in the sand for a lot of Russians. I think working there, you realize you're in a place that's very interesting and it's kind of the heart of a huge news story. But at the same time, it's also a place where kind of less is happening than ever before. Because the nature of this kind of Russia Putin's created is it's been 20 years where he has wanted apathy. He's broken down independent movements, autonomous, political movements, or, even more innocuous things sort of seem to no longer exist in Russia, because I think there's a real fear that grassroots movements can go somewhere and they're uncontrollable. So you get a real sense of sort of suppression now. I mean, what Russians actually think and feel about the war, I mean, there is quite a lot of good polling out there, but even polling doesn't really necessarily show the whole picture. I think there isn't much enthusiasm for war, even if support is quite high. So I don't know. It's quite a surreal place to be. I mean, in the film, obviously, we've got a lot of interesting people we spoke to, but I mean, the real effort was trying to get people to talk to us, because a lot of people don't want to speak to you. They don't have much to say, particularly in the way we wanted to make a film, which was like, going to people's homes, see the kind of work they do, sort of get under the skin a bit more. Like a lot of Russians, they're wary of foreign media, and they've got a lot of reason to be wary of foreign media and being associated with foreigners. So that in itself was hard. But yeah, I mean, I think there's a sense of apathy, and it's kind of quite a surreal and strange place to be, where you're not quite sure what everyone thinks and feels.
So what is it like then being foreign media in that country? How are you treated by the authorities?
I mean, it really depends. I mean, after Evan Gershkovich's arrest, it's kind of unclear how foreign media is being treated. And I mean, certainly after he was arrested, the way we were working changed quite a lot, because the status quo was completely broken. I mean, that's the first Western journalist to be arrested since the 80s. So it really meant that you didn't quite know where the line was anymore. Like previously, people like Sarah Rainsford, they were deported. You can be fined in Russia as a foreigner, and often if you got some administrative charges, say you'd like accidentally gone into the border zone or something, place where foreigners aren't meant to be, maybe you'd get deported, maybe you'd get fined. That seemed to be like the worst that would happen. But after Evan, there really isn't an upper limit on what may happen to you. I mean, there's still a good number, not many, but there are still quite a few West outlets, like Steve Rosenberg, BBC, Sky News, NPR. They have people there or people in and out. But I think they've basically created a sense of fear where you don't know where the line is anymore, basically.
And end up possibly being arrested on trumped-up espionage charges like Evan did.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, and that was very 0 to 60. That's the thing. I mean, since the war, they passed loads of laws that were, discrediting the military as a crime, which in actuality means saying something the Russian government doesn't like about the military. It could be a true thing about the military, could get you arrested. But instead of arresting him for something like that, they went straight to espionage. So I mean, that was quite a severe escalation. I mean, before his arrest, I was always like, well, I think if they start deporting a few people first, if they start arresting someone for one of the lesser charges, then I thought it would be like a graduation to like, maybe it's time for us to get out and stop working here or change what we're doing. But I mean, it was very much like, and also at that time, a lot of journalists had come back to Russia, like foreign journalists, Western journalists, because after the invasion, the laws were changed. There was a lot of people going, well, what's the new status quo? We should get out of country for a bit and just see. So at that time, like a few journalists were like, well, it seems like it's actually okay. People have been putting out some work. They haven't really been mincing their words too much in there. And Russia is still going by the premise, well, you're publishing in English, you're publishing in a foreign language. We're not too bothered about what you're saying to a foreign audience. That used to be the status quo. So journalists were coming back in, and then everyone was arrested, and, it's all up in the air about what the new rules are.
Wow. Okay, so Russia invades Ukraine. What sort of narrative about the invasion and the war more generally is available within Russia?
I mean, there's kind of one narrative, but then there's also sort of many narratives. I mean, there seems to be an approach of sort of throwing a lot of stuff at the wall and seeing what sticks, basically. So, and the narrative has shifted somewhat over the war. I mean, there's obviously the very clear hyperbolic, these are Nazis in Ukraine and they need to be challenged. That has probably died down a bit, but it is still also sort of a mainstream bit of the rhetoric, because this war has been tied into the Great Patriotic War, what Russians call the Second World War. So it is sold and still being sold as a continuation of that struggle, essentially a struggle of good versus evil. So, I mean, that messaging hasn't really shifted too much. I mean, there is some polling to suggest that actually less Russians are watching TV. So again, there is maybe a degree to which there's a disengagement with it. Russians don't want to hear it. But I mean, there's a lot of victimhood. Russia has been wronged by the West. It's been wronged by America. It's a great power that has been humiliated. Like it is kind of a bit of a snowflake mentality in a way, like this great nation that's been insulted and humiliated. And it's interesting that the other sort of laws that have changed since the course of the war is further restrictions on sort of LGBT plus communities. So there's also this bit in which they see this as part of a sort of cultural struggle against sort of decadent foreign ideas as well. So, but again, it's hard to know how effective it is. It is a lot of noise, and there are true believers who believe in it, but they're also pouring a lot of money into, and this is something we touch on the film, into basically younger platforms, into the internet, putting propaganda out on the internet as well. A lot of it, though, I do think it does work to a degree, and I think the most worrying thing is where we might be in sort of 10 years' time if this is an ongoing conflict. Because Russia now, there's a lot of people who, they had Twitter, they had Instagram, they had an outward-facing world. They've been to Europe maybe multiple times. But now you've got a situation where patriotic lessons in school, new sort of emerging youth movements, and the fact that if a child is growing up in this propaganda atmosphere now, well, also you've had a real brain drain of sort of diverse ideas as well, with people who had different points of view leaving the country. I think it's worrying where it might be in a few years' time. I think at the moment it's still sort of struggling to get a hold of people who remember the world before.
Okay, so on that point then about differing ideas, I mean, what shape does opposition take? Is there any kind of meaningful or extensive dissent? I mean, I think we'll come to talk about Navalny later in this conversation, but just sort of on like a general population level, how does opposition find expression? Does it find expression, full stop? I
mean, basically, no, I think is the case now. I mean, I think this is a 20-year project. Putin, even from the beginning, it was clear he had authoritarian tendencies, and they've only increased and increased and increased. So I think today, I mean, I was there, like the invasion happened overnight, but the next day people went to protest, and they went to protest, a place like Pushkin Square, famous place in Moscow, for protests. And everyone that came there, they were just getting chucked into the backs of vans. The square was already like barricaded off. No one could actually congregate. There's no leaders to any political movement anymore. They're all in exile or incarcerated. So, and on a very practical level, there's a good, at least 20% of the Russian population who don't agree with this war, and certainly don't agree with Putin. But there isn't really a meaningful way for them to gather or congregate or express their ideas anymore. I mean, you can go out, as many people did. I mean, probably not as many as a lot of people would like, and I understand that as well. But they go out and they get arrested, and you get fined, or maybe you get jail time. It doesn't really achieve much. I mean, that every sort of, apart from the fact that Russia has technically oppositional parties, the managed opposition, the Liberal Democratic Party, who are ultra nationalists, or the Communist Party, who they vote with the United Russia all the time. There is these faux oppositions, but I mean they don't provide any real opposition. I mean there isn't really, Ilya Yashin and Vladimir Karamurza, like these other oppositional figures. Again, they're also in prison. Obviously Navalny. There isn't really a voice. People resist on a personal level. I mean that's what our film is on some level about. It's talking to people who are, they'd call themselves in the activist space, but they're not known people, but they're people who were resisting in their own way, and you see the consequences for their very mild opposition, what happens to them. Like there isn't a space for free ideas or free expression or autonomous movements. I mean, even if you go back sort of 5-10 years in Russia, had groups like the Night Wolves, the bikers that supported Putin, or like sort of football hooligans who were sort of nationalists, and there was these movements that had like some degree of autonomy, but they were maybe nationalist and still pro-Putin. But you just seem like there isn't really any movements at all. And even when they've had like, like you see people out in a crowd with these, or Luzhniki Stadium celebrating something, these are all such fictitious events. They're state workers who are sent there. It doesn't mean that they might not support the war. They might. But they're not there on choice. They're there because they're told to go there and they're told to do social media. So a lot of the events I've been to, like the annexation, when they announced the territories they're taking in Ukraine were now officially Russian soil. They integrated the regions. People we asked, they were workers. Most people said they did support the war, but they were sent there because they were state employees. So like everything is kind of astroturf. Even like I think there's a real fear of a genuine movement of whatever stripe it is, and you see that with something like Wagner or Strelkov, the pro-war blogger. These pro-war people who have now become, and they were pro-Putin, but they potentially turn on Putin as they have done. They've become some of the most critical voices. So that's the thing. If you allow autonomy, even if it is initially on your side, there's a risk it can then sort of come back at you.
Tell me about these activists then. Tell me about Artyom. Tell me about the people you interviewed.
So Artyom, I mean, he's one of many sort of cases you can choose in Russia. He's someone who, after the mobilization, the military draft happened in September, October 2022. He went out in response to that to protest it. He's a gathering of probably 15, 20 people max, public gathering in a square, and he's reading poetry to this group of people. And he is arrested the day after. He is violently arrested. He's also, according to his partner, sodomized with a metal bar during the arrest, filmed in humiliating positions. His partner, Alexandra, who's also in a film, is beaten as well. And that's for a poem, a few words of poetry, and not particularly like outrageous either. I mean, they were sort of anti the war. I mean, the thing is they were kind of a bit nuanced. Like I can't really easily explain them to a viewer because it wasn't like down with Putin or anything that strong. But what they believe happened was a sort of provocateur, someone with sort of pro-government, pro-Kremlin beliefs or works for the state in some capacity, filmed them, submitted the video, and the security services decided to act. And that's the thing about Russia. You might not be necessarily arrested because of something you say or do, but the thing is you could be. There's so many examples of someone like Artyom where they have stepped out of line in some way, and then the whole weight of the law has been thrown on top of them. Like in the film, he's facing 10.5 years is the maximum sentence he may get. So yeah, you could say something to a friend in a bar, critical of Putin or whatever, and Russians do, and that's fine. But the thing is, the wrong person hears it, or someone decides to make an issue out of it, it can become a very big problem for you.
As echoes of sort of East Germany, Stasi Germany.
Yeah, absolutely.
What do you make of former Fox News journalist Tucker Carlson interviewing Putin? Is he kind of a useful idiot in all of this?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, this kind of strain of sort of the right, particularly in America, I mean, it does exist here to a degree as well, but where they see sort of common cause with Putin, I think because they see him as almost, I don't know if is it as reductionist to say as they see him as a kind of bulwark against like wokeism or something, against the fact that he's turned against sort of progressively socially progressive ideas. Is it as simple as that he's a strong man? I mean, I think frankly it's quite embarrassing, particularly with the timing of like Navalny's death as well, to be going around Russian supermarkets sniffing bread and putting tokens into supermarket trolleys. I mean, this is it's just really sort of embarrassing. I mean, within his fan base, maybe it'll do well. But I mean, you're in the capital of an authoritarian state. Yeah, it's going to look pretty clean and swanky because that is not Russia. Like Moscow is. There's huge wealth disparities in Russia. 25%, 20% of Russians don't have indoor toilets. But that's one side of Russia. And the average wage is low. The Russian economy, I don't know, was maybe around the size of Spain. I think probably a bit less after the war. But I mean, that's a country of 150 million people. That's not a very big economy for that size of nation. So to be going there and sort of, I don't know, worshipping at the altar of sort of of the Russian state, and and he's been impressed by the bread. I mean, the bread in Russia is fine in the nice supermarkets, but it's nothing particularly special.
We've got it. We've got the scoop. The bread is not all it's made out to be. The bread is not all it's made out to be.
But also, I mean, what a fumble with the interview. You've got, I guess, Putin giving a monologue he's given, numerous times before. Yeah, great get to be sitting there with Putin. But I mean, that's also the lie that Tucker Carlson said that, no other journalist has been here. Plenty of journalists have asked. I think Steve Rosenberg said for the BBC, said he asked 4 times they've requested an interview. There's a reason Tucker got the invite.
Damning. Let's talk about Navalny a little bit. You mentioned the sort of the unfortunate timing of his death in relation to that interview. And also possibly, it might not actually be unfortunate, right? It could be completely intentional. How was Navalny viewed in Russia? Would people talk to you about what they thought about him?
He didn't come up too much. I guess in some ways, maybe he wasn't too relevant to some of the things we were asking at that time. I mean, it's interesting at a moment, like we had a lot more people bring up Prigozhin during our time there. Which is an interesting one because obviously, like, he's kind of certainly pro-war, and pro-war people did bring him up. But I think he also was kind of interesting because he was someone who was also critical of the status quo. And in a vacuum of Russia where there's very few people who could be outwardly critical, I mean, someone like him, surprisingly, people did mention him. But back to Navalny, I think to some degree he was viewed as a more metropolitan figure by a lot of Russians, like, someone whose base was more in sort of Moscow, St. Petersburg, people who were a bit more educated, which I think is true. But I mean, I think that probably sort of dumbs down the complexity of him as a figure. I mean, obviously he had like a sort of nationalist background as well, which maybe to some, I think he apologized for some of the things he said earlier. Maybe to some degree it was political expedience. He thought it was a useful thing to be, and I think, to some degree, that is also true. Like, I think he had more of a broad impact than some figures because he did have a bit of a populist streak. And also, the Overton window of sort of Russian politics is quite different from sort of British politics. As a rule, generally people are a bit more nationalistic and jingoistic, probably. So I don't know. But I think you can't really dispute his bravery to go back. I mean, I've heard some people said he kind of thought maybe an uprising would come from him being arrested. I don't know if that's the case. I mean, I think, like he said, he thought if you're going to be an oppositional figure, you need to be in Russia. And, he did avoid meeting European leaders. He didn't want to have his movement and the message be discredited by being seen as a sort of lackey or a stooge of the West. And I think that was probably quite shrewd of him. And, I mean, the fact he probably had a more nationalist edge to him also probably made him more of a threat. And I think the fact that Putin didn't want to say his name also is sort of indicative of how powerful a figure he was.
Since he died, his wife's been removed from Twitter, owned by Elon Musk. Both he and Carlson like to kind of characterize themselves as bastions of free speech, of, standing against cancel culture. Closing remarks from you, I guess. What would you like to say to individuals like that about the actual state of free speech within Russia?
Well, I mean, it doesn't exist. That doesn't mean not any individual could hold an opinion, because people can hold opinions. But the fact is there's been a creation of a state of sort of paranoia and fear where you might be okay, but if you do say something, potentially you could face very severe consequences. There isn't free speech there. And I think any sort of whitewashing or sort of, pretending about what the state of Russian society is, I think is just very dangerous, and for people who claim to be journalists is just wrong. I mean, it's a very complex and diverse society, but it is a society with a lot of poverty. It is a society where the free exchange of ideas doesn't really exist in any meaningful way, and that's not going to get better soon either, I don't think.
Andy, where and when can people watch your
So
documentary?
it's coming out on the anniversary of the invasion, full-scale invasion. So that's on the 24th of February, this Saturday.
Where will people be able to find it?
On YouTube.
Perfect.
Vice's News' channel.
Andy, thank you so much for taking the time. Really
Lovely.
appreciate it.
Lovely. Thanks so much.